Frank last appeared on American Pickers in March 2020 before taking time off to undergo back surgery. Despite Frank expressing his desire to return to the show, Mike announced he was officially fired from the series in 2021.
He spent his entire life digging through other people's forgotten treasures. Barns, garages, attics, dead ends, and somehow turning rust into gold. But what if I told you that behind the dusty barns, rusty signs, and hidden corners of American Pickers, there was a real-life story far more emotional, complicated, and shocking than anything we ever saw on camera? Because when Frank Fritz passed away on September 30th, 2024, at just 60 years old, what they uncovered inside his private estate didn't just surprise fans, it left them speechless. A broken friendship, secret health battles, a $6 million legal war, and a garage full of unbelievable treasures. This isn't just about antiques. It's about everything he left behind. The Rise, America's favorite picker. Let's start where it all began to shine, because before the drama, before the stroke, before the lawsuits, there was a TV show that genuinely changed the game. American Pickers premiered on the History Channel on January 18, 2010, and it was, by almost every measure, an overnight phenomenon. Over 3.1 million people tuned in for that very first episode, which, for a show about two guys driving around in a white van buying old stuff from strangers, is nothing short of remarkable. The premise was simple. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz would roll up to barns, farms, and cluttered properties across rural America, sift through decades of forgotten junk, and walk away with objects that told stories nobody else thought were worth telling. But it wasn't the antiques that people really fell in love with. It was them. And if we're being honest, Frank was the one who made it feel real. Where Mike could come across as the smooth-talking businessman with an eye for resale value, Frank was your funny, slightly scruffy, emotionally intelligent best friend who would stop in the middle of a field just to hold a rusty old fire helmet and tell you why it mattered. He had this disarming warmth, a kind of everyman charm that made viewers feel like they were riding shotgun with an old pal. His love for vintage fire department memorabilia and beat-up motorcycles wasn't performed. It was bone deep, the kind of passion you can't fake on camera, and audiences sensed it immediately. But here's something longtime fans started noticing. Something subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. There were moments, especially in later seasons, where Frank didn't seem quite like himself. The energy was still there, the jokes still landed, but there was a certain fatigue underneath it all. A kind of heaviness that didn't match the upbeat tone of the show. Sometimes he'd lean on objects a little longer than necessary. Sometimes he'd go quiet while Mike carried the conversation. And if you go back and rewatch those episodes now, knowing what we know, it hits completely different. Because what looked like a guy just having an off day was actually someone pushing through real physical pain just to keep going. That's the part of fame people rarely talk about. When you become part of something that millions of people rely on for comfort, for entertainment, for routine, you don't always get to stop when your body tells you to. You keep showing up. You keep smiling. You keep filming. And Frank did exactly that. Until he couldn't anymore. The show ran for over a decade, filming across dozens of states and clocking more than 300 episodes. It made both men household names. Merchandise, spin-offs, fan conventions, the whole machine kicked into gear. Frank opened his own antique store, Frank Fritz Finds, in Savannah, Illinois, and it became a genuine destination for fans who wanted to feel close to the man they watched on their screens every week. For a guy who never set out to be famous, Frank had built something pretty extraordinary. But behind every fun road trip episode, Frank was quietly managing a body that was starting to fall apart, and a personal life far more complicated than the easy smiles on TV ever let on. The cameras caught the treasure hunts. They didn't catch the cost. So before we get to the darkness that would eventually swallow his final years, let's rewind. Let's go back to the very beginning, back to a kid in Iowa who didn't know it yet, but was already building his whole identity around a single obsession: things that other people threw away. But who exactly was Frank Fritz before the cameras found him? Where did this picker come from? And what shaped the man that millions of Americans came to love? You might be surprised. Stick around, because that story hits different. The boy from Davenport, Frank's early life. October 11th, 1963. Davenport, Iowa. A city that sits right on the Mississippi River. The kind of blue-collar Midwestern town where everybody knows everybody's family and nobody really leaves unless they have a very good reason. That's where Frank Fritz was born, and in a lot of ways Davenport never really left him, even after he became famous. From the time he was a child, Frank was different in the best possible way. While other kids were fixated on sports cards or video games, Frank was fixated on stuff. Old stuff. Weird stuff. The kind of stuff that gathered dust in grandparents' basements and got tossed out on curbs every spring. He started collecting as a young boy, drawn to objects with history baked into them. The dents, the scratches, the mystery of where something had been and who had touched it before him. It wasn't hoarding. It was almost spiritual. He genuinely believed that objects had stories, and that those stories deserved to be preserved. His particular obsession with fire department memorabilia started young. Vintage helmets, old badges, brass nozzles. Frank thought they were the most American things imaginable. Men who ran toward danger while everyone else ran away, and the tools they used to do it. For a kid growing up in the heartland, there was something deeply romantic about that. As he got older, the collecting expanded. Motorcycles entered the picture, not just as machines, but as rolling sculptures. Frank had a specific taste: Indian motorcycles, classic Harley-Davidsons, half-finished custom choppers sitting in someone's shed waiting to be loved again. He would track them down the way other people tracked down rare books or concert tickets, and he was relentless about it. He didn't go the traditional route after high school, no 4-year degree, no corporate ladder to climb. Instead, Frank leaned into what he knew. He worked odd jobs, kept collecting, kept buying and trading, and eventually built a small operation he called Frank's Finds. It was humble, it was scrappy, but it was his. And it was that little shop, that street-level hustle, that eventually caught the attention of a fellow Iowa picker by the name of Mike Wolfe. The two men shared a worldview. They both believed that America's back roads were loaded with buried treasures that nobody was paying attention to. They both had an almost evangelical belief in the value of things the rest of the world had written off as junk. And when the idea for a television show started to take shape, it felt like destiny. Two guys from Iowa, doing what they'd always done, except now with cameras and a national audience. Frank Fritz didn't stumble into fame. He earned his way there through decades of obsession, hustle, and genuine love for the forgotten and the overlooked. But fame, as Frank would eventually discover, doesn't protect you from the things falling apart inside your own body. And Frank's body had been keeping a very serious secret. Just how bad did things get behind the scenes of American Pickers? What were Frank's producers and co-stars watching him go through? And why didn't we, the audience, know any of it until it was almost too late? The body breaking down, health battles, and hidden struggles. Here's a thing about Frank Fritz that the show quietly glossed over for years. He was sick, not a little under the weather, chronically, painfully, relentlessly sick. And he showed up to work anyway, season after season, because that's who he was. Frank had been living with Crohn's disease for most of his adult life. If you're not familiar, Crohn's is a brutal autoimmune condition that causes severe inflammation in the digestive tract. We're talking crippling abdominal pain, exhausting fatigue, dramatic weight changes, and a daily existence that can feel like your own body is waging war against you. It is not a background condition. It demands your full attention. And Frank managed it for years while filming a physically demanding television show, traveling constantly, and projecting warmth and energy on camera. And here's the thing that makes Frank's situation even more intense. Crohn's disease isn't predictable. There's no clean schedule, no warning system. One day you can function almost normally, and the next day you are completely wiped out, stuck dealing with symptoms that make even basic tasks feel impossible. Now imagine trying to film a national TV show like that. Long drives, unpredictable locations, limited access to proper medical care on the road. Frank didn't just deal with that, he hid it. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because he didn't want it to define him. And in a strange way, that decision may have made things worse. Because while viewers saw a steady, reliable presence on their screens, behind the scenes, the pressure was building. Physically, mentally, emotionally. And when everything finally started to collapse, it didn't happen slowly. It happened all at once. Then came the back surgery. At some point, Frank's spine became a whole separate emergency. The surgery he underwent was not minor. The man came out of it with 185 stitches and metal rods in his back. 185 stitches. Let that sink in for a second. This was major reconstructive surgery on a man who was already fighting Crohn's disease, and it forced a significant period away from the show. He was open about the fact that recovery was brutal. And underneath all of that, woven through the physical pain, the long stretches of downtime, the isolation of recovery, there was a struggle with addiction that Frank eventually spoke about with remarkable honesty. He acknowledged it publicly, didn't try to spin it or bury it, and made genuine efforts to address it. His manager, Bill Stanky, confirmed that Frank was dealing with multiple layers of health challenges right up until the end of his life. The combination, the Crohn's, the back surgery, the addiction battles, all of it started to catch up with him during filming. By 2020 and into 2021, his absences from the show became more frequent. Fans noticed. The internet started buzzing with questions. Then, in July 2021, Mike Wolfe posted a statement on social media confirming what many fans had feared. Frank Fritz would not be returning to American Pickers. The statement was measured, polished, and said all the right things about love and support. But reading between the lines, there was something it wasn't saying, and that something was about to become a very public, very messy story. Because Frank himself wasn't nearly as polished about it. He went on record, raw, unfiltered, clearly hurt, and said that Mike Wolfe had never once reached out to check on him during his entire recovery. Not a phone call, not a text, nothing. "I haven't heard from Mike," Frank said. "That kind of hurts." For a man who had spent over a decade as your on-screen best friend, those words landed like a gut punch, both for fans and, presumably, for Mike himself. The public took sides. The internet exploded. And the bromance that had powered 11 years of television was suddenly looking like it had never been quite what it seemed. But how deep did the rift between Frank and Mike really go, And was there something darker happening behind the scenes of their split that the network didn't want you to know about? The fallout. Frank, Mike, and the bitter split. Let's be real. The Frank and Mike breakup was one of the messiest reality TV fallouts of that whole era, and it didn't get nearly enough attention. When Mike Wolf made the announcement that Frank was out, the official framing was sympathetic. Frank's health, Frank's journey, wishing him well. But Frank's version of events was dramatically different, and he gave several interviews where he made clear that he felt abandoned. He didn't just feel pushed out of the show. He felt like the friendship he thought he had, the one that cameras had broadcast into millions of living rooms, had turned out to be something less than real. There were immediate accusations from fans and commentators that the network had used Frank's health struggles as a convenient opportunity to phase him out, bringing in new cast members to refresh the format while Frank was too sick to fight back. Whether that's entirely fair is debatable. Production decisions are almost never that simple. But the optics were rough, and the fact that Mike had allegedly not reached out during Frank's recovery gave the accusations real fuel. What makes this fallout even more complicated is the nature of reality television itself. Because when you spend over a decade filming with someone, sharing road trips, meals, negotiations, the particular intimacy of long drives through nowhere, you don't just become co-workers. You become part of each other's lives in a way that's hard to explain to anyone outside that bubble. So when that relationship breaks down, it's not just a professional split. It's personal, deeply personal. And for fans, that's what made it so uncomfortable to watch. Because what they thought was a genuine friendship suddenly felt uncertain. Like maybe some of it had been real and some of it had been performance. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Both things can exist at the same time. You can care about someone and still drift apart. You can build something meaningful and still lose it. And in Frank and Mike's case, it seems like that's exactly what happened, which makes their eventual reunion even more emotional, because it suggests that whatever broke between them never fully erased what they once had. For his part, Mike responded carefully. He maintained publicly that he cared deeply about Frank, that the situation was complicated. But the silence between them, two men who had spent over a decade riding around in a van together, was deafening. And it stretched on for almost 2 full years. Then, in May 2023, almost a full year after Frank's stroke, sources close to both men revealed that Frank had asked to see Mike. Whether it was a reckoning with mortality, a genuine desire to make peace, or simply love winning out over pride, Frank reached out, and Mike came. By all accounts, the reunion was emotional and raw. Mike reportedly told Frank that nobody could ever replace him. Not on the show. Not in his life. Friends described both men in tears. For a story that had felt for so long like it was heading toward a permanently bitter ending, this detail shifts everything. It suggests that whatever broke between them was never beyond repair. Mike later shared publicly that in Frank's final days, he was by his side. He said he held Frank's hand and told him that he loved him. The grudge didn't survive. The friendship did. But before that reunion could happen, Frank had to survive something that very nearly took him before any of this was possible. What exactly happened on that July day in 2022 that changed Frank Fritz's story forever? And just how close did America come to losing him years before his actual death? The stroke, the silence, and the slow goodbye. July 2022. Frank Fritz was at his farmhouse in Davenport, Iowa, the same $155,000 property where he kept his bikes, his collection, his life, when he suffered a massive stroke. He was alone. By the time help arrived, the damage was severe. Frank spent roughly a month in the hospital. The stroke had devastated his ability to function independently, affecting his mobility, his speech, his capacity to make decisions for himself. The man who had spent decades picking through America's forgotten corners, sharp-eyed and relentlessly curious, now couldn't lift his own arm without it falling back down. And if you really think about it, the most heartbreaking part of Frank's stroke isn't just what it did to his body. It's what it took from his identity. This was a man who made a living through movement, traveling, exploring, digging, discovering. His entire personality was built around curiosity and independence, the freedom to go wherever he wanted, chase whatever lead caught his attention, and turn it into something meaningful. The stroke didn't just limit that, it erased it. And for someone like Frank, that kind of loss cuts deeper than physical pain. It's psychological, it's emotional, it's the kind of thing that changes how you see yourself. Friends said he was frustrated, that he knew exactly what he had lost. And that awareness, that's what made his final years so difficult. Because he wasn't just fighting to stay alive, he was grieving the version of himself he used to be. In August 2022, his loved ones filed for guardianship and conservatorship on his behalf, and the courts granted it. His friend Chris Davis became his legal guardian. Midwest One Bank was appointed conservator. The documents obtained by the U.S. Sun were blunt in their assessment. Frank's decision-making capacity was so severely impaired that he was unable to care for himself or manage his own affairs. He needed 24-hour care. Jerry Gendro, a friend who had known Frank for decades, didn't sugarcoat what those nursing home visits were like. He said that one side of Frank's body was completely paralyzed, describing how Frank would lift his arm up and it would just drop back down. Gendro added that it must have been incredibly difficult for Frank to be totally bedridden. He described Frank as frustrated, with a mind trapped inside a body that no longer cooperated, and recalled that there were days when Frank's will to keep fighting seemed to fade. Gendro also said he believed Frank could have lived much longer if the will to live had still been there. Medical bills reportedly reached approximately $29,000 per month. $29,000 a month just to keep existing. Even for a man with a $6 million estate, that is a brutal, relentless financial drain. And it gives you context for why the legal battles around his estate would eventually become so fierce. Frank's health declined slowly but steadily over the 2 years following the stroke. He was also suffering from aortic stenosis, a narrowing of the heart's aortic valve that restricts blood flow and places enormous strain on the heart. Between the stroke damage and the heart condition, there was no realistic road back. His body was shutting down piece by piece. He died on September 30th, 2024. He was 60 years old. The History Channel and Cineflex Productions released a statement. We are saddened to share that our friend and beloved member of the History Channel and American Pickers family, Frank Fritz, has passed away. Those who knew him described a man who had spent his final chapter surrounded by the people who loved him most, even if the last years had stripped away almost everything else. His last recorded words have been widely circulated since his death. They were characteristic Frank, poetic, a little melancholy, and perfectly fitting for a man who devoted his life to rescuing the past. The past is never really gone. It's always with us, hiding in the shadows. So what did Frank leave behind? And why is his estate, right now, the center of a legal war that has dragged in his friends, his family, and a $6 million question that nobody seems able to answer? The estate, $6 million, a contested will, and a garage full of ghosts. Okay, This is the part you came for. What exactly did they find when they opened the doors to Frank Fritz's world? Let's start with the garage, because this is where Frank's obsession lived in its purest, most undisturbed form. Before his stroke, Frank had taken photos showing rows upon rows of motorcycles packed into an outhouse on his Davenport farmhouse property. And when we say rows, we mean rows. Indian motorcycles, rare, sought after, the kind collectors chase across state lines. Classic Harley-Davidsons in various states of restoration. Custom choppers, some finished and gleaming, others still half-assembled mid-project. Frozen in time, like he'd just stepped away from the workbench for a moment and never came back. These weren't just toys or props. These were Frank's life's work. Each one represented a discovery, a negotiation, probably a road trip, and a handshake deal with a farmer somewhere off the beaten path. And here's something that really stands out when people started documenting the collection after his death. Not everything was finished. In fact, a surprising number of the bikes were mid-restoration, tools still nearby, parts carefully laid out, notes scribbled. It was like walking into a paused moment, like time had stopped in the middle of Frank doing what he loved most. And that detail? That hits hard, because it tells you something important about how he lived. Frank wasn't just collecting for the sake of owning things, he was constantly working on them, improving them, bringing them back to life. It wasn't about the end result, it was about the process. And in a way, that makes the collection feel less like a finished legacy and more like an ongoing conversation that got interrupted, which makes the question of what happens to it next even more emotional. Because once those bikes are sold, scattered, or displayed, that chapter is truly closed. His friend Jerry Gendreau confirmed that the plan is to auction the collection. "That's what I would do because of his fan base," Gendreau said. "I think he'll do really, really well with an auction." Some of the bikes are also expected to be displayed at Hog Dogs, a bar and antique store Gendreau operates, with the idea of rows of Frank's motorcycles running down the center of the room like a moving shrine. Beyond the bikes, there's the broader antique collection, vintage signs, fire department memorabilia, and all the other accumulated artifacts of a lifetime spent picking. His store, Frank Fritz Finds in Savannah, Illinois, continued operating even after his stroke. And now, with Frank gone, all of it is part of an estate estimated at $6 million. But here's where things get complicated. Very, very complicated. Frank's lawyer had quietly filed his will with the court on October 2023, a year before his death, to keep it safe. After he died, a certificate was issued approving the will on October 18, 2024. Case closed, right? Wrong. On December 30th, 2024, an attorney entered the case on behalf of a friend of Frank's, signaling that someone close to him was not happy with the contents of the will. Then, on February 3, 2025, that attorney filed a formal petition to set aside the will entirely, essentially arguing it should be legally invalidated and demanding a trial. Then it got even messier. By late February 2025, Fox News and multiple other outlets confirmed that Frank's father, William, had also filed a separate challenge through his own attorney, Corey F. Gorley. William's legal team argued that the will, allegedly executed in 2023, while Frank was already under guardianship, was invalid, that Frank didn't have the mental capacity to sign it, and that the guardianship itself had driven a wedge between Frank and his family, allegedly preventing his father from having any meaningful contact with him. A purported will was filed with the probate court by an associate of Frank's, Gorley told Fox News Digital. We have filed a petition on behalf of Frank's family challenging the validity of that will. We believe the evidence will ultimately show that the will is invalid for at least one, if not multiple reasons. Friends and sources are divided. One person close to Frank insisted he was in his right mind when he signed the will. Another described him as totally bedridden, unable to lift his arm in the months beforehand. The case files are sealed. The public can't see what the will actually says, only that multiple parties are fighting hard to either preserve it or destroy it. And here's where things take an even darker turn. Because at its core, this isn't just about money. It's about control. Who gets to decide what Frank's life meant? Who gets to speak for him now that he's gone? Was the will truly his voice, or the result of outside influence during a time when he was at his most vulnerable? These are the kinds of questions courts struggle with, especially in cases involving illness, guardianship, and late-life decisions. And they rarely have clean answers. What they do have are consequences, because by the time this is settled, relationships will be damaged beyond repair. Lines will be drawn. And the story of Frank Fritz won't just be about his life anymore. It'll also be about what happened after it ended. What we do know is this: a man who spent his life unearthing forgotten things, who believed that objects carried the weight of the lives that touched them, has now left behind a $6 million puzzle that his own people can't agree on how to solve. The bikes sit in the garage. The antiques wait in the store. The lawyers are circling. And somewhere in all of it, the real story of what Frank Fritz wanted for his life's collection, the one he built piece by piece over 60 years, is waiting to be picked out from the wreckage. Frank Fritz was never just a TV personality. He was a picker in the truest, most human sense, a man who believed that nothing worth keeping should ever be thrown away. And now, the people who loved him are fighting over what he kept. His bikes, his antiques, his $6 million, his name, it's all in play. And the story is far from over. We will be watching every single twist of that court case. And the moment there's news, you will hear it here first. If this story hit you the way it hit us, smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop in the comments, what do you think Frank would have wanted done with his collection?